Quick note before we start. This video is for education and entertainment, and it's built on a genuinely alarming stack of research. Alright, let's dig. For most of the 20th century, science was absolutely certain it knew who the first Americans were, and when they arrived. The story was clean, it was taught as fact, and it had a name, Clovis First. And over the last few decades, that certainty has quietly, spectacularly collapsed. The story of who really first set foot in the Americas is being rewritten right now, in real time, and some of the new evidence is so old and so strange that it's forcing scientists to consider possibilities that would have gotten you laughed out of the room a generation ago. Let's start with the old story, because you were probably taught some version of it. Around 13,000 years ago, a group of people crossed from Siberia into Alaska over a land bridge called Beringia, a stretch of exposed seafloor that appeared during the Ice Age, when so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped. These people then travelled down through an ice-free corridor that opened up between the great glaciers and spread across the Americas, with a distinctive style of beautifully made stone spear point. We call those points Clovis Points, named after the town in New Mexico where they were first identified, and for decades the rule was ironclad. Clovis was first. Nobody was here before them. Any site claiming to be older got picked apart until it fell. It's worth understanding why Clovis First was so dominant for so long, because it wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. A culture of intense skepticism grew up around any pre-Clovis claim. That skepticism was reasonable. The problem is that it hardened into dogma, and the standard of proof became so punishing that almost nothing could clear it. The land bridge part of the story is solid. That's real. Beringia genuinely existed. The genetics confirms that ancient Link, the ancestors of Native Americans, genuinely did have their roots in populations connected to Siberia. What's collapsed is the timing and the neat single-file story of how and when they got here. The cracks started appearing at sites that just refused to be Clovis. The most famous, Monte Verde in southern Chile, that's about as far from the Alaskan land bridge as you can get and still be on the same landmass. And Monte Verde has been dated to older than the Clovis culture up north. If people were living at the southern tip of South America before the Clovis culture even appears in North America, then the whole story is physically impossible. You can't have descendants living thousands of miles south before their supposed ancestors have even arrived. Monte Verde was fought over ferociously for years. That's how threatening it was to the consensus. But it held up, and once it held, the dam broke. If Clovis wasn't first, the door was open for everything older. Sites across the Americas began yielding evidence of human presence that predated Clovis by thousands of years. And then came the discovery that really lit to the fuse. The footprints at White Sands. In White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers found fossilized human footprints, actual tracks, pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore. And these weren't the footprints of tall adults on a hunt. Many of them were made by teenagers and children, walking along the shoreline in what must have been an ordinary moment of ordinary life thousands of years ago. When the team dated these prints, they got a result that stunned everyone. Around 21 to 23,000 years old. That is not a little older than Clovis. That is roughly 10,000 years older. That's people walking around New Mexico during the absolute height of the last ice age, long before that ice-free corridor was even open. The White Sands dates have been challenged. Some researchers questioned whether the seeds used for dating might have absorbed old carbon, but the team went back and dated the site again, using completely independent methods, and the ancient ages held up. The evidence for people at White Sands during the peak of the Ice Age is now genuinely formidable. So here's the problem it creates, and it's a beautiful problem. If people were in the Americas 20,000 plus years ago, during the height of the Ice Age, they could not have walked down that ice-free corridor, because at that time, the corridor was closed. The glaciers were merged into a solid, lethal wall of ice. So how did they get past it? The leading answer is elegant, and it's called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Instead of walking down the middle of the continent through ice, maybe the first Americans came down the coast, by boat or on foot along the shoreline. The Pacific coastline, even during the Ice Age, was lined with rich kelp forests, teeming with fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds. A continuous ribbon of food running all the way from Asia down the west coast of the Americas. A people who knew how to live off the sea could have followed that ribbon south, leapfrogging down the coast, entirely bypassing the wall of ice inland. The frustrating catch is that the coastline they would have travelled is now underwater. Sea levels rose when the glaciers melted. The best theory we have points its finger at a place we can barely look. And then there are the truly wild claims out at the fringe. There's a site in California, the Cerutti Mastodon site, where some researchers claim to have found broken mastodon bones deliberately smashed by people. The claimed age? Around 130,000 years. That date is wildly, enormously older than anything else. So old that it would mean a human-like species was in the Americas before Homo sapiens had even spread across the Old World. The overwhelming majority of researchers are deeply sceptical, and the likeliest explanation is that natural forces, not people, broke those bones. I'm not telling you Cerutti is real. I'm telling you it exists and it's argued about. The fact that serious people are even fighting about it tells you how thoroughly the old certainty has evaporated. The field went from, we know exactly when they came, to, we're arguing about a range of 100,000 years in a single generation. The genetics adds another rich layer. When researchers study the DNA of ancient and living Native American populations, they find evidence of a long isolation period. A period sometimes called the Beringian Standstill, where the ancestors of Native Americans may have lived in Beringia for thousands of years, cut off before moving south. Once people did spread into the Americas, the population split surprisingly early into major branches that fanned out across two continents. There are genuine puzzles in the data. Faint, strange signals hinting at connections to populations you wouldn't expect. The picture the genes paint is not one tidy march. It's a story of isolation, of pauses, of multiple movements, a small founding group that then exploded across an entire hemisphere. Many indigenous peoples of the Americas have long held, through their own oral traditions, that they have been on this land since time immemorial. For a long time, Western science dismissed that entirely, confident in its 13,000-year Clovis timeline. As the scientific dates get pushed older and older, the gap between the archaeological story and those deep time claims of belonging narrows. The people whose ancestors these actually were had a sense of profound antiquity on this land, and science spent a century underestimating exactly how deep that antiquity ran. Let's step back and appreciate what's actually happening here, because it's science at its best. A story that was taught as settled fact, Clovis First, turned out to be wrong. Not because the original scientists were fools, they built the best model they could with the evidence they had. But new evidence came in, and the model couldn't hold it. Rather than defend the old story to the death, the field is, however reluctantly and messily, changing its mind. That's not a failure of science. That is the entire point of science. The willingness to say we were wrong, the first Americans were here far earlier than we thought. That's the system working exactly as it should. And I think there's something genuinely moving in what the new evidence shows us. Because remember those footprints at White Sands. Not warriors, not a heroic expedition, teenagers and children walking along a lakeshore during the Ice Age. In a New Mexico that had camels and mammoths and dire wolves in it. Kids being kids on an ordinary day, more than 20,000 years ago, in a land no human had ever seen before them. They didn't know they were first. They didn't know they were making history. They were just walking home along the water, and their footprints outlasted their entire world. So the next time someone tells you the first Americans arrived 13,000 years ago and marched down a corridor with their Clovis spears, you can tell them the real story is older, weirder, and still being written. They may have come by sea, down a highway of kelp, during the deep freeze of the Ice Age, thousands of years earlier than anyone believed. And some of the very first of them left their footprints in the mud of a lakeshore, where children walked. All the sources are in the description: Monte Verde, the White Sands footprints, the Kelp Highway hypothesis, and the Cerutti controversy. Go read them. because this is one of the fastest moving arguments in all of archaeology right now. And remember, those kids on the lakeshore are somebody's family, and in the deep sense, they're all of ours. So stay curious about how much we're still figuring out, and keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye.